WNST, Towson, Baltimore, East Coast to the West Coast in Game 5 out in Las Vegas. Marty Conway joins us now. He remembers the postseason as a longtime Orioles executive in 1983, and of course through the change at Camden Yards that went on to the Texas Rangers, has now found a good life at Georgetown University as a professor of business there and marketing executive as well. You can find him out at Marty Conway on Twitter, and he doesn't blog often enough on LinkedIn, but he is there. And a very available individual. And, man, I love talking to you about prosperity when it happens on the business front for a sports franchise, because certainly it's a difficult thing to do to win, to be playing hockey in June. Anybody who's a Caps fan, you lived in the market here all of your life, you know how rarefied this air is. You know, my wife's going down there on Saturday watching the games on the big screen in the streets. My son's going down to see Fall Out Boy. Sting's there. Shaggy's there. I mean, it brings this and especially in a town like Vegas, where all they do is party. Marty, I've never seen Vegas as worked up as it is.
Yeah, I bet. This is just a confluence of incredible coincidence and great work. And everybody knows the story now of Vegas being an expansion team. But we know also that they really weren't an expansion team because of the way that the NHL did the expansion draft this time. Most of those players on that team, or many of the players on that team, came as a result of trades that took some dollars from a team, and in return they got some draft picks as well. So George McPhee did an incredible job of using the system right now to his advantage and taking players like Marc-Andre Fleury, taking that payroll off of the hands of the Pittsburgh Penguins at a time when the Penguins really needed to do it. So, but I think in general most people see them as an expansion team, even though we know that, on the inside they're quite different than that. But nonetheless, it makes it exciting for a new market. Last year it was Nashville. This year it's Vegas. So whenever that happens to a sport, and I've said this before about baseball, whenever it happens to a new market, or in the case of the Capitals, where they haven't been in it for 20 years, it does expand the pool. It does expand the pie for the sport, which ultimately is good for everybody involved, good for owners, good for the league, and certainly good for the players.
Well, certainly there was no thought for me on Saturday night that I was not attending something special. Now, I was out in Vegas all week. Vegas is Vegas. The minute you get off the plane, you see the Go Knights go. Everywhere there's Golden Knights gear and hats and shirts and all that. I got down to Washington on Saturday night, and I honestly had never seen D.C. like that, and I'm not a D.C. guy. I'm a Baltimore guy, famously. For the Wizards, it's been since the Big E and 40 years ago, as I'm sure you remember as a young man, and I was a kid at the time. And then the Orioles, it's been so long there, and we had our little cup of coffee a couple of years ago and saw how that could reinvigorate something. But the Redskins have owned Washington forever, and to walk around and watch Capitals fans on Saturday night. I'm talking young people, old people, black people, white people, families, young kids out in the streets, all wearing stuff that really is going to be a memory that I don't think you can replicate in any other way. And Marty, I'll say this on the Stanley Cup, and maybe they really get it right in some way, that these days off and the building of this tournament, if it were to go 6 or 7 games, and there's no thought that it won't at this point, that this becomes even more fun than like a Super Bowl, because they only play the game once, one time, 2 weeks out. This thing has twists and turns and days off and travel and injuries, and the league gets involved with whether Tom Wilson should be suspended or not. There really is something about the drama of the way hockey builds that makes it even better than baseball and football to some degree.
Well, and also look at the locations. If you look at, we're in the heart of downtown D.C. for this at the Capital One Arena, formerly the Verizon Center. And in addition to the arena itself, you're blocking off streets. You have the ability to have concerts and, Sting and Shaggy and Fall Out Boy and all those types of things. So that coupled with the ability for social media and amplification, it puts it on a whole different level. So the Redskins haven't been playoff relevant per se. They've been in the playoffs once or twice, but they made a brief appearance. They haven't been playoff relevant for a couple decades. And so Washington, D.C., the Nats have been in the playoffs, but they haven't gotten beyond the first round. So, I've seen Ted talk, a dozen times, and he always talks about just wanting to bring a parade to Washington, D.C. That's his one goal as an owner. is to have that success so that they can have a Stanley Cup parade or an NBA championship type parade. He really wants to see Washington D.C. activated as a sports town in the way that he knows it can be, and now it's possible. Look, halfway there, and we'll see what happens the rest of the way.
Marty, your background with EBW, with Larry Lucchino, and trying to save the Orioles for Baltimore, and now a generation later, seeing what Angelos has begat here, and look, we discussed that dumpster fire and their malaise into the summer will be well documented. But on the baseball side, there was always a thought that Washington couldn't, wouldn't, never had through the Twins and the Rangers era supported baseball. They've come closer in the last couple of years maybe than the Caps have, in that they've been a dominant team. They've had that opportunity. That it's become sort of a baseball town is also not lost on me, because when I'm down there, I see tons of Nationals gear, and that is sort of the summer outdoor $20 to get in. Watching all of these people in lawn chairs and sitting on the dirty ground outside of 8th Street watching a television, I would think it looks more like a baseball crowd than a hockey crowd. And as a cost to entry, if you want a $20 ticket, there's no such thing in the Stanley Cup Finals. I think the Nationals stand to benefit from a lot of this enthusiasm if there's some point where they can win, because I know up here that the brand is very damaged, as I pointed out with its academic over the weekend on my Twitter feed and Adam Jones, and about to get more damaged here. But I think the baseball brand down there will benefit from this.
Well, it's about access. Sports is about access, so keep that in mind. So the second thing is that, Nationals Park is down there in the district in D.C. It's not that far from Capital One. And then also, the new D.C. United Stadium will be just a couple of blocks from that. So they're going to have 3 facilities, hockey, basketball, baseball, soccer, all probably within a 2.5 mile radius there down to in the immediate D.C. area. And that makes a difference. So number one, access makes a difference. To go to a football game, you still have to go out to Landover. You have to figure out the parking. You have to do all that. And so in a lot of respects, the Redskins, although they remain the overall sort of overhanging dominant franchise when it comes to, because football is just that. But in terms of activation of young people in particular, it's really been around the Caps and the Nationals. And you saw that with people walking around wearing jerseys. And reminder, in 4 or 6 weeks from now, they're going to host the All-Star Game, which will be a whole other set of events that will go on there in July. And so the pendulum has swung, and I really think that Dan Snyder is almost desperate to get a new stadium. I'm sure would love to have it in the district. It's probably not going to happen. It's probably going to have to be tangentially out there on the suburbs of Virginia, somewhere where people can get to. But that's really the issue right now for teams is, number one, access, price, those kinds of things, so you can generate excitement so that people can participate in ways without having to buy a ticket. And I know that's difficult for an owner to sort of stomach that they're really not getting that, but increasingly... Well,
that's the only physical thing you get when you're Dan Snyder, is like you got 8 games, and how many asses are in my seats, and why are the seats empty? And that's the thing Bisciotti's had to figure out, right?
We've talked about before that as owners look to spread their wings, recognizing that, some of the limitations of sold-out games and suites and things like that, that they're looking to develop real estate around the stadium. Those are the owners of the future who can really activate public and private dollars to build those kind of ancillary facilities like they have in St. Louis and other places. And so, yes, it's great. Look, franchises in the NFL and the NBA are continuing to rise in value. But at the end of the day, if you really want true triple, quadruple value, you need those kinds of things. So, pivoting to the Capitals, this falls at a perfect time for Ted and his organization, because they're going to be opening a new small arena for the Mystics and some other things over in Ward 8. That's going to open this fall. That's been under development for a couple of years. The next big thing is Capital One Arena is approaching 25 years, which for a building built when it was, it's going to be time. So they're going to be looking for a new location, and this will just be a really nice tailwind for any conversation about what has to happen, either with a new building or some sort of substantial renovation to Capital One, like they did to Madison Square Garden over several years ago. Because as you know from being down there, it's a really interesting and great facility, but there are serious limitations to how they really can monetize that opportunity. And I really.
What do you mean by that? I mean, I don't realize that. I still feel like Camden Yards is a new building. I know it's not. I get around. I see the new buildings all the time. I mean, I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma at a Rush concert 3 years ago and thought to myself, wow, this is a building. I don't know what separates that from the Staples Center. Hey, I was in Vegas all last week. It's a nice building, but it's, it doesn't look to be anything different than what they have in Cleveland or what they have in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's building's very nice, by the way, too, but I don't know how that's different. Tell me.
Yeah, so number one, next time you go, look around the concourse. It's really restricted. They've got a lot of different things, so the square footage that they can use to generate dollars is way more limited than you'll see. Specifically, you mentioned Pittsburgh. When you walk around the arena in Pittsburgh, you can walk around that concourse and never lose sight of the hockey game going on. It's sort of see-through, and all the concessions are on the outside. So that's just the nature of something built 20 or 25 years ago, which Camden Yards and Capital One, at the time it was MCI, were built, versus what's been built in the last 5 or 10 years.
Well, the example would be in Philadelphia. You can watch for baseball. So this is back. You can watch the game and not have to leave the bowl. And we've talked about that with Camden Yards as being a problem. Sure.
Yeah. Now, what you don't see is one level down, the service level for Capital One Arena is really small. And it's really difficult to get things in and out. That's why, I know they don't have the circus there anymore, but some of the things that were really difficult, when they had the circus or a horse show, they used to have to block off F Street in order to handle all of that because the service level just didn't take care of it. And then the last piece is the various levels of seating. One of the things that's occurred over time is, that sort of club level seating, that whole concept has changed. And so while it's a really nice building and seats 18,000, the upside opportunity for them, I'm looking at the next 20 years, has a lot of limitations to it. So as I said, I think that while it's not a conversation that's going to result in a new building in the next 3 to 5 years, it's certainly going to be a building that's going to occur in the next 5 to 10 years, or they're going to have to take significant steps to close down parts of that, like during the summer or other times, in order to do the kinds of renovation that's going to need to bring the dollar level up that would support franchises over the next 25 years.
He is Marty Conway, the sports executive, and at Georgetown. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Just want to reset. Go ahead, keep going.
No, I was going to say that the second part of that is the role of the playoffs to an NHL team. And so, last fall, Ted Leonsis and his monumental ownership group, which owns the Wizards, which owns the Caps, and all of that, the building itself.
And part of the big network as well, right?
Yeah, they sold a stake, a 20% stake in their entire organization to Steve Jobs' widow, Lorraine Powell Jobs. Sold reportedly for 20% stake. She invested with her brothers about $500 million. So she's now the second largest investor behind Ted in the organization. That brought the value to the whole property, hockey, basketball, arena, et cetera, to $2.5 billion. They speculate now that they value the NBA team at about $1 billion, the NHL team at around $600 million, and the rest is from building revenues, the Mystics, and other kinds of things of the sort. So that was significant because now we've got a little bit of a tailwind, and the importance to the making a deep run in the playoffs for an NHL team is all about the revenue that they retain in each subsequent round. So, for example, if you have tickets on the glass for the regular season, you're paying about $175. And in subsequent rounds, you're getting to the point where the tickets on the glass for a Stanley Cup final round are around $800 to $900. Now, that's just face value to the season ticket holder. You can imagine what that is in the secondary market. And the important thing is that the NHL is one of the revenue share. It doesn't have the media revenue sharing that the NFL and Major League Baseball or even in the NBA has. So they really have to survive. Each team does an operating income, on average of about $135 million compared to, you've seen the operating incomes of the NFL teams. And so selling those season tickets, the concessions, and all the premium things that go with it are increasingly important. And when you get through the Stanley Cup and you get into the Stanley Cup finals, each team is keeping about 65% of that revenue overall. 35% of that revenue is going into a revenue-sharing pot. And there's a really complicated formula in the NHL to do that. But ultimately, the point is, over the last several years, the operating income for the Capitals has been around $10 to $15 million. It's really been a slim operation. This will bust through that and give the team some breathing room over the next couple of years to potentially keep some of these players that they might have had to let go. Remember, prior to the season, the Capitals were in a bit of a business transition. They were letting some players go, and they were trying to build with new, younger players. And so, like I said, this really works out at a really good time, both financially and on the ice for the team. And then hopefully it opens up for them new opportunities in Baltimore, surrounding D.C., Northern Virginia, for new fan bases and new sponsors and new opportunities.
He is the sports business professor of all things good at Georgetown University. You can follow him at Marty Conway on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. The one-time poobah of the Orioles. And, I'm leaving the Orioles alone here during this conversation, Marty. I mean, we'll get to them later. We'll talk about them. We got the World Cup starting here next week. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But the last thing is I'm getting back on a plane to go out to Vegas to hopefully at some point hoist Lord Stanley's chalice and drag it up and down the strip where they were serving White Russians last week and making fun of Ovechkin. So we'll see how that goes this week. But seeing the birth of a franchise out there, and I guess the only thing I have it to compare it to, and I wasn't around really for the Nationals when David Cope started that thing and they did that in RFK, and that was such a different kind of transition. But this birth of the Vegas franchise in the NHL to 11 months later a Stanley Cup final, and to see what the fallout of that's going to be, that I see so many kids there, so many families there, people, to your point, they can't get into the games because of the secondary market. They want to party out in front of New York. I wonder what that means for hockey there, that we think of Green Bay as being this cradle of football, and we see what baseball means in places like Chicago to the Cubs and the Red Sox, in places where they didn't win for 100 years but sustained the franchise. I don't know that that is sustainable when I have been to Florida for Stanley Cup Finals games 20 years ago, and the Panthers are Titan down there. The Carolina Hurricanes went to a final 12 years ago. My wife and I went down there for that when they played Calgary. I don't know that that's a particularly stable franchise. I don't know what's a blip and what is stability. And I guess Jacksonville would be a great example of that in the NFL, right, Marty, where out of the gate they did well. They haven't sold the place out in 20 years down there, and the upper deck's always empty there. It always feels like it's going to be empty. And we talk about Shad Khan moving the team to London. Vegas out of the gate, it's gotten this great start, but I don't know that long term it's great to go to a Stanley Cup final in the beginning because they might not go for another 20 years.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, sports is a fickle business, and you're right. There's a whole lot of franchises that have had some success within their first, 2 to 5 years, whatever it's been, and then haven't retasted it. But one thing that I can tell you is it does drive participation. And one of the things that hockey needs really is, right now there are 30 hockey markets. 23 of those are outside of Canada, which, we all, know is the birthplace really and the holy grail for hockey. There's not going to be, in the foreseeable future, likely any new hockey franchises in Canada for a lot of reasons. Most of the expansion for hockey is going to come from both the United States and whatever other international appeal that the NHL can generate.
By the way, every time you say that, there's somebody out there that says Hamilton will have a team and Quebec will have a team because the league lords, in the same way that nobody ever thought it would come back to Winnipeg, right? Like, literally.
Yeah, I think Quebec City might be the only population. I think there's Toronto has, you talked about Hamilton, you talked about some other places. Toronto has very successful, certainly NHL franchise, but their AHL team is in the finals. The Toronto Marlies are in the AHL finals. So they've got plenty of hockey to take care of themselves in those markets. But what I was going to point out is that in 2016, the first overall draft pick of the 2016 NHL draft to the Toronto Maple Leafs was a kid named Austin Matthews. And where Austin Matthews is from is Scottsdale, Arizona. Now, you would have never thought that the first overall draft pick in the NHL, for all the great players, the Sidney Crosbys and everybody else that's come through, that he would have been from a city in Phoenix, just outside of Phoenix, Arizona, right? So I think it's a good indication that even though Florida and Arizona, and at least up until last year, Nashville, they hadn't really, generated the success on the ice, it really has generated, Gary Bettman's strategy has grown hockey into markets where there are enormous populations, and that helps in the participation of the sport, which builds it for the long term. So maybe, in 10 or 15 years from now, Vegas will have the number one pick in the expansion draft of 2030 or sometime like that, and we'll look back and we'll say, that first run that they made to the Stanley Cup playoffs really energized a kid that was playing soccer, that was playing basketball, or wasn't playing any sport, and his parents got him involved in hockey, and it took off from there. So I think there's a couple of sides to this. There's the franchise itself, but if you're in leadership for the NHL, your job is to build not only your franchise values, but it's to build participation and interest in the U.S., in Canada, and around the world for your product.
Marty, last thing for you on the hockey thing, and I'll just leave. If you're the president of the team, if you're Ted Leonsis or you're Dick Patrick, wherever you are, and certainly Dick Patrick's been running this thing since you were running the Orioles 30 years ago, what does it mean to win or lose this week? You know what I mean? Financially, spiritually, for the future, that if they were to blow a 2-1 lead and lose this thing in 6 or 7, which is certainly, they're the Capitals, whatever you want to say, is there such a margin here that winning for Ovechkin, certainly, he's going to be in the Hall of Fame either way. It's more about legitimacy and for, the footnotes for him and having his, obviously his name on the cup and all of that. But what does it mean for the franchise over the next 5 years that they win or lose this week?
Yeah, well, winning would be perennial, right? Winning would be something that would be celebrated every 5 years, every 10 years, along the way. It's an anchor point for everybody. It's an anchor point for media, for fans. It's merchandise. It's taking your kids, if you can get them to the game, or taking them downtown to the games, watching from the outside, or it's taking them to the parade. It's kind of creating those perennial moments. Losing in the finals, I think, creates sort of an annual opportunity. What I mean by that is you'll get some overhang at least into next season in terms of new opportunities and sponsorships, maybe some opportunity to raise prices in certain parts of the arena. As I said, maybe have some conversations about what needs to be done to the arena, and there's some more public support for that. So clearly, financially, it's going to be an increased opportunity for everybody, whether you run a business around the arena, whether you're connected to the Capitals sponsorship. And then lastly, players cashing in on this either through contracts or certainly, TJ Oshie or other people like that becoming much more of a household name in terms of commercial opportunities and different things. So it's a game changer in a lot of ways, but winning the entire thing changes the footing of the franchise, I think, for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And it puts them in a position where people start talking about them next year as, can the Capitals repeat? And, that's not something that, that puts you in a conversation with like Pittsburgh and some other teams where if they can show that ability, now you're starting to build something that is incredibly sustainable and puts you in a position of Detroit, Pittsburgh, places like that where hockey on an annual basis, you say, plan your June to be in the Stanley Cup Finals because, this franchise is capable of doing that. That's one of the potential outcomes for sure.
Marty, I did 168 hours of radio here at WNST last week. I think 164 of them were hockey. That's not a bad place to be Memorial Day week for a guy like me, but in a town like Baltimore where hockey never worked, I was out to dinner with Gene Ubriaco the other night, which I'm sure is a name and a blast from the past for you on the hockey side, but we did a 9 share here, on Game 3 the other night. Baltimore has adopted a Washington team, and that would never happen with the Redskins, certainly wouldn't happen with the Nationals, and I don't believe it would ever really happen with the Wizards anymore.
No, I think that's right. The gap, look, you got a gap between Washington and now Hershey because, I think there would have been a really interesting opportunity had we been 20 years hence for a minor league hockey team potentially here in Baltimore, but now that top Capitals affiliate is in Hershey, Pennsylvania. So the Capitals have done a really decent job of building a bridge between Washington and Hershey, which puts Baltimore right in the middle of that major population center. Ted has the indoor arena football team. So there's some connections that they've continued to try to draw, but look, the Baltimore market also includes, Prince George, I'm talking about for television, includes PG County, all of Howard County, and the eastern half of Montgomery County. So in addition to the Baltimore metro areas, you have those 2.5 counties that are part of the TV market. That is really in the strike zone for Capitals following, right? You've got a lot of hockey played in Howard County, eastern Montgomery County, and parts of PG County at the youth level. So I can see why that there would be some spillover. And while they're doing a 15 in Washington, DMA. They're doing a little over half of that in Baltimore. So hats off to them. Like I said, now that Ted's organization is involved and has a 1/3 ownership of the broadcaster, NBC Sports Washington, all of this starts to become like a flywheel, and it allows for success for a lot of people in the middle of it and a lot of people on the edges and on the surface of it.
Marty Conway is our friend. He is the professor of all things sports business at Georgetown University. And, I almost feel like I should invite you back next week and we should do the World Cup thing, like as a separate aside. But just, scratching the surface for the World Cup, we're a week and a half out. Dude, my calendar's loaded up. And I want to remind anybody that's like sort of new to World Cup or only watches every 4 years, part of it really is much like the Olympics. Like, what time are the games on? The games are going to be on primarily between 6 a.m. and 5 in the afternoon, much like Saturdays and Premier League soccer is. It's going to be a morning and midday event around here in live real time. And, we're a week out on Portugal and Spain playing on Friday afternoon and Argentina and Iceland getting us up early in the morning on Saturday and Germany and Mexico playing at lunchtime next Sunday. I mean, these are massive, massive games and in a setting where, many people, including me, believe the Russian government's been involved in running our government. This will be a nice little cozy chance for Donnie and Putin to get together here and talk about world events, right?
Yeah, well, by the time this all happens, and I think the first match is the 15th or 16th or something like that, it's Russia and Saudi Arabia. But in between now and then, which hopefully we'll have some more time to talk about in the future, but June 13th is the date of which FIFA Congress will come together in Moscow, and they will have a series of votes. And that day will determine the 2026 host of the World Cup. And I think, as most people know, the United States is facing only one bidding country, and that's Morocco. And recently, FIFA has come together and scored the bids, and essentially it's over before it started, even though there will be a balloting process. The average score out of 5 for the U.S. in terms of their bid is over 4. It's almost 4.5. And Morocco's bid at about 2.5, which is, unless you get to 2, you get eliminated. And so just everything from the revenues doubling in the U.S., all that. So June the 13th will be an interesting time for soccer fans in the U.S. to tune in because that's the date on which we'll have a ballot. And the choices are the North America bid between Canada, the United States, and Mexico versus Morocco. And I think most people think that after some formalities in round 1 where some of the African nations and others will have to vote for Morocco, that by the time it gets to round 2, the U.S. will be awarded the World Cup. And then Baltimore has been, I think, in one of the final 23 cities in the running for hosting some matches in the U.S., and so it'll be off and running at that point. So I think it's going to be interesting. It's going to be on Fox, I think, from mid-June till mid-July. We're really going to be captured in those storylines that you mentioned, whether it's Portugal, Spain, Germany, Argentina, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's going to be a great time for sports, certainly for soccer, and really interesting time in the U.S. Even though the team is not there, I think there's going to be some interest in looking at, even though it's 8 years in the future, what's likely to happen.
Well, I know I'm going to miss those 3 big events where, the U.S. gets together and loses to Ghana or, wherever. And at least the disappointment is all over. And listen, this is my question, and I don't want you to answer it. It's rhetorical now. You can put this in your pipe and smoke it for next week when we get together and really talk World Cup. But has the U.S. gotten better at bribing, or has FIFA gotten cleaned up? That's going to be the question for all of this, because this whole idea of Russia hosting the World Cup was all about bribery and chicanery and crooked politics, quite frankly. So, and I guess that'll be addressed next week by somebody smarter than I.
Well, there's going to be plenty to talk about that because so you're right. Save that for.
But sports and politics never mix, right? I mean, going back to Munich in '72, in '68, never. But I'm sure sports and politics are going to find a cozy little opportunity beginning. By the way, it's next Thursday that we kick off the World Cup. It is the 14th. Just so everybody knows, 11 in the morning, Russia plays Saudi Arabia. That is the only game on the 14th. It really kicks off in earnest on the morning of the 15th, next Friday. So by then, I'll be drunk with the Stanley Cup, Marty.
Awesome.
Marty Conway is our friend. He's at Georgetown University. He's at LinkedIn. He's at Twitter. You can find him for all sorts of intelligent things. Marty, rest up. We got a cup to kiss, buddy.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Marty Conway, my dear friend, former executive with the Baltimore Orioles as well as the Texas Rangers and AOL. Go find him on Twitter if you want to get smart about sports business and where the money goes and all that stuff. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram. I stream live right here on our Facebook Live as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. Anything you miss, you want to find in the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. Our morning newspaper also includes the entries for Laurel this weekend and the Maryland Jockey Club also on the front of WNST.net. So get down to the racetrack this weekend and see all the renovations. Let us get ready for sports gambling in Maryland. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570 and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.